Danielle Bregoli was a total menace. At the age of 13, she stole cars, ran away from home, and even tried to frame her own mother for a crime. She was the poster child for troubled teens, and her mum felt like it was time for a professional to step in. But the professional in question wasn't even a practicing doctor at the time. He just called himself one on TV. The infamous Dr. Phil show was one of many exploitative reality TV concepts that invited vulnerable people onto the stage to talk through their very real problems while the audience laughed and booed at them. Even if you've never seen Danielle Bregoli's episode of this show, I'm sure you're familiar with her infamous catchphrase, "Catch me outside, how about that?" Danielle was a laughing stock to the audience, but Dr. Phil offered to help her. As soon as filming wrapped, Danielle would be put into a car by his team and sent off to Turnabout Ranch, a boarding facility hundreds of miles away in the middle of the desert that corrects the bad behavior of troubled teens like her. But what Danielle experienced after that Dr. Phil episode was nothing short of a complete nightmare. Instead of receiving help and healing, Danielle and all of those other kids were only further abused and traumatized by an industry completely rotten from the inside. For most kids, these camps were the worst experiences of their lives, and some people didn't even make it out of them alive. Danielle has since come out and shared her experience of a murder that took place at Turnabout Ranch literally while she was there when she was 13 years old. Thankfully, Danielle made it out to tell her story, so thank God it's Freaky Friday. We're gonna start from the very beginning. It's gonna be a Danielle Bregoli deep dive, baby! And even more than that, the more serious undertone of this video, we're gonna be going into the network of sinister, abusive behavior correctional facilities for kids. Quickly before we get into this episode, I want to thank our sponsor for making this video possible, Rocket Money. A lot of you might know that I am a cat mum. I have 2 little cats and I love them with every inch of my being. Oh my god, I love them almost as much as you guys do. Jokes, obviously, I love them more. But if you're a cat owner or just a pet owner in general, you will understand how much money goes into those gorgeous, lovely, fluffy little things. All the toys, all the specialist food, different cat furniture, you know, it costs an arm and a leg. And then God forbid they ever have to go to the vets. I mean, touch wood. I'm gonna have to touch wood now. That scared me. Well, today's sponsor, Rocket Money, is here to help you keep track of those finances. Their app analyzes your spending habits and then can create custom budgets that work with your lifestyle. You can separate your spending by category, and it can even send you a little alert if you've gone over your budget for one particular category. So if you feel like you're blowing all your money on like Deliveroo and Uber Eats during the week, Rocket Money's gonna let you know about it. Trust me, Rocket Money's gonna let you know about that. But you know what? It's a good thing. Overall, they are gonna help you to save more and spend less. On average, Rocket Money has helped its customers to save $740 a year, which is insane. So, why not join the already 5 million members using Rocket Money today? You can click the link down below in the description of this video. That's rocketmoney.com/Eleanor, and you can get started for free. And I mean, you can unlock even more features with premium as well. That's rocketmoney.com/Eleanor to get started for free. Thanks again, Rocket Money, for sponsoring this episode. Quickly before we get into the episode, I just want to let you know that we're going to be covering a lot of sensitive topics in this video, like a lot, including but not limited to cancer, sexual assault, and abuse of all kinds. If you feel like any of these topics might be too intense for you to listen to right now, I would recommend clicking out of this episode now. Hopefully I'll get to see you some other time with a different story, but until then, look after yourself. While we make every effort to fact check our sources and make sure that all of our information is correct, no action should be taken in reliance upon the information in this episode. episode. And with all that being said, let's get into how Bhad Bhabie and so many other children have survived these hell camps. So we start off in Florida in March 2003, the Sunshine State, the home of Disney World, a chuffing lot of alligators, and Florida men. You know that meme about Florida men, how like whenever there's a crazy story in the news, it's always Florida man steals neighbor's peacock, or Florida man stabs a tourist despite not having any arms. Yeah, that one's actually real. That's actually real. There is always a Florida man up to something. That much we can be sure of. But anyway, Florida, with all of its pros and all of its cons, was home to the Bhad Bhabie. Her full name was Danielle Bregoli. She was born in the city of Boynton Beach on March 26th, 2003, making her an Aries, which makes a lot of sense. Aries are supposed to be very like hot-headed, fiery, impulsive, if you know Danielle. So, when she was first born, her mother and her father were both 35 years old. Her mother, Barbara Ann Bregoli, worked as a compliance analyst. I don't know what that is. And her father, Ira Peskowitz, was a police officer. But less than a year after the birth of their daughter, Ira left Barbara Ann. And Danielle, he wasn't really in Danielle's life at all from that point forward. He did actually try to file for joint custody for Danielle when she was like 1 year old, and that wasn't successful. So I'm not sure what happened there. I'm not sure why that decision was made. But regardless, Danielle was raised by two women mainly. Her mother, Barbara Ann, and her grandmother, also named Barbara. And Danielle's childhood was filled with a lot of anxiety that was coming at her from a lot of different angles. She lived in a rather dangerous area that was often linked to gang activity, and while there's never been any proof that Danielle herself was involved in a gang to any degree, but growing up in that kind of environment is going to leave an imprint on you. You would grow up very hypervigilant, and I guess violence and aggression is very normalized where she lived. But the main thing that had an effect on Danny in her childhood by far were her mother's bouts of breast cancer. Barbara Ann was diagnosed for the first time in 2007 when Danielle was just 4 years old. So at that point, she might not have fully understood what was going on, but one thing was for certain, and that was Mummy was obviously very, very sick. As a toddler, Danielle would have to hold her mother's hair back for her while she vomited after her chemotherapy. She would rub aloe vera on her mum's chest to try to soothe where the radiation was keeping the cancer at bay. So her mother's illness was very apparent to her. I mean, even if Barbara Ann would have wanted to, there was no way she would have been able to keep her illness a secret from her child. She was a single mother at this point in time, and the two of them kind of had to work as a unit now to keep each other afloat. In 2009, Barbara Ann went into remission. So she'd only had the cancer for about 2 years, but then 5 years after that, when Danielle was 11, it came back. And it was at this point when her mum got cancer for the second time that Danielle's life and her whole personality completely changed. Up until that point, her mother said that Danielle had been a spoiled but loving child who slept in her bed quite often, especially during the worst parts of her cancer. Danielle was a mummy's girl as a child. Her and her mum were super close, but then, like I say, with this second bout of cancer, everything changed. This was around the time that Danielle was turning 12 as well, so there were a lot of different forces at play. Sometimes around this age, kids will turn into teenagers, cranky, nuisance teenagers. And that's what her mum thought was going on at first. She didn't think too much into it. Kids go through rebellious phases. So when Danielle started to get a bit of an attitude and started to pull away from her mother a bit, she wanted more independence, she didn't want to hang out with her mum as much. Barbara Ann didn't take it personally at first, but very quickly, Danielle fell into quite a troublesome crowd at school, and I think this really accelerated these negative changes that her mother was seeing at this point in time. Danielle's new best friend was 3 years older than her. She was a 15-year-old girl that was already heavily tattooed. The two of them started skipping school together to go off and smoke weed, and then at one point, this friend introduced her to Xanax. This is a 12, 13-year-old girl. Danielle was changing at a rapid rate, and at this point she would come home and start arguments with her mother. She was very volatile and confrontational. By the time Danielle's 13th birthday rolled around, police had already been to Barbara Ann's house to speak with her about her troubled teen over a dozen times. I feel like I'm going to be reminding you of this a lot, but she was 13! Where do you find the time to get yourself in that much trouble at 13 years old? Danielle hung around on the streets a lot in her free time, just generally up to no good, being a nuisance. And so that was a lot of the involvement that the police had with her, was picking her and her friends up off the streets when they were causing issues and dropping them off back home. And there were actually even a few occasions where Barbara Ann had called the police herself on Danielle because Danielle was out of control. But there was actually one occasion where Danielle was the one that called 911, and she was actually calling to report her mother for a crime. She told them that she had seen her mother snorting heroin in the family home and the police needed to come to put a stop to it. So of course they came right out, they stormed into the house and had a search, and they found the quote-unquote drugs in Barbara Ann's bathroom. When they had a closer look at this white powder, they realised that it was actually icing sugar that Danielle had wrapped in a piece of cling film and then planted in her mother's bathroom to then try to frame her for doing drugs in the family home. That is insane to me. Like, that is absolutely insane. I know that her and her mother had a very volatile relationship, and a lot of the time they would, or at least Danielle was just trying to get at her mum. But this is like serious. Imagine the police were actually like dumb enough to believe that the icing sugar was heroin and they didn't even bother testing it or looking twice. Like, they just believed it. Her mum would then be in prison. She would be taken away from her mum. Like, she would have been taken away and put in a home, surely. Did she realise that her mum is her sole carer? So if she gets her put away in prison for doing drugs whilst looking after a child, then what did Danielle think was going to happen to her in that situation? I just want to know. So anyway, the police have a look at this powder. They realise that this kid is, I don't know, wasting their time, having them on. So when the police find this icing sugar, they give Danielle an option. They say, right, we can go and take this to the lab and test it and do this the hard way. Or you could just admit to us right now that this is fake and you have tried to frame your mum. And so Danielle admitted that yes, it was her. She tried to frame her mum. And so with that, Danielle was actually the one that was put in the back of the cop car and taken to the police station, not her mum, which was the aim. It had completely backfired on her. It had Uno reverse carded onto her. And I think Danielle was only given a warning. I don't think there was anything really like put on her record, but she was told off for abusing the 911 service and for making a false police report. Barbara Ann was really, really starting to struggle. I mean, it had been a growing struggle over the last year. Ever since Danielle started to turn, it was a bit more gradual in the beginning, but over this last few months before her 13th birthday, it was insane. Their small family was struggling enough as it was without Danielle causing so much extra trouble. Their financial situation had been rocky for years. I mean, ever since Barbara Ann had first been diagnosed with cancer in 2007, she had to stop working. So this is a single mother that can't work. She's too sick to even properly do the housework and maintain a household and a family with Danielle. They were just barely getting by on social security checks and credit cards. And then in comes Storm Danielle. Not an actual storm, just Danielle Bregoli stealing her mum's credit cards and running them up to the tune of $4,000. A $4,000 credit card bill when you can't even work a job to be able to pay it off is absolutely insane and so very scary. But I'm sure 12, 13-year-old Danielle didn't understand the value of money, the value of thousands of dollars at that point in her life. You don't really understand just how valuable money is until you start trading your hours of your life for it. Maybe she thought that $4,000 was easy for her mum to make back, but oh my God, did this throw them into not only obviously a huge financial hole, but also even more arguments. Her mother was now anxious and depressed. So was Danielle. One of the things that she had bought on this massive online shopping spree was a stripper pole to put up in her bedroom. And I know that, well, it's like a dancing pole, isn't it? Not all poles have to be stripper poles, but that is what Danielle and her family referred to this pole in her bedroom as, the stripper pole. But of course, Danielle, just being a 13-year-old girl, was just like swinging about on it. On top of the $4,000 of credit card debt, Danielle had also stolen a bunch of her mum's jewelry. She would regularly steal her car and just go driving around in it without permission. Again, let me remind you, 13 years old, couldn't even learn to drive, even if she wanted to. But she would literally just run and find her mum's handbag, grab the keys out, and then go and jump in the car and speed off. And her mum wouldn't be able to do anything about it. A devastating part of this story is that Danielle's best friend at the time was actually working as a prostitute. And I believe it was that 15-year-old girl that was heavily tattooed that she met when she was 12. Which, like, take a second to digest that. How heartbreaking is that a 15-year-old girl has turned to prostitution? But this friend started to introduce Danielle to a lot of seedy characters. And Danielle was super young and impressionable. I mean, they all were, but especially her. She was 12, 13 when she was meeting all of these people, and they were committing petty crimes. They were very violent and confrontational and argumentative with just other people in the streets. So I think that's where she's learning a lot of this aggression and this, like, confrontational, volatile energy. Whenever she has a small confrontation in her life, her knee-jerk reaction is to go violent, to go aggressive, to shout and fight her corner. And eventually that anger and aggression started coming back home with Danielle to her mother's house. When they would have arguments, sometimes they would get like lightly physical with each other, where they'd push each other or throw things, but it started getting worse. On at least one occasion, Danielle intentionally punched her mother in the chest. Her mother, the breast cancer survivor. I'm not sure how much Barbara Ann's cancer was affecting her at that specific moment in time, but Danielle definitely punched her there on purpose, because she knew that that was how to hurt her mother. Just imagine being Barbara Ann and going through one of the worst experiences anyone would ever have to go through. Well, and she had to go through it twice. She got cancer twice. And then years later, your own daughter uses that to hurt you. But Danielle was aggressive and violent in all kinds of ways. There was at least one occasion where she threatened her mother and her grandmother with a knife. Like, her own family were genuinely scared of her at this point. And as I keep saying, she's 13. What an interesting, unique, and also concerning dynamic for two grown women to be so afraid of this child that they have raised that now seems to be turning on them and wanting to hurt them. Barbara Ann wanted to send Danielle to a specialist school, somewhere that would be better equipped to deal with her anger issues, somewhere that could give her dedicated counselling as well as keeping her education on track and making sure that she stayed out of trouble. But those kind of schools cost money that they just didn't have. So instead of that, Barbara Ann wrote to a different kind of specialist, begging for help with her unruly teen, someone that had helped hundreds, if not thousands, of other families up and down the country, Dr. Phil. The Dr. Phil show was an absolute sensation, at least while it was in people's good books. Not so much anymore, and Danielle's case is actually one of the reasons why a lot of people don't look so fondly on Dr. Phil or his show anymore. But back then in the 2010s, it definitely was highly respected. The whole selling point was that it was hosted by a real doctor. People could bring their problems to the stage, and Dr. Phil would psychoanalyze them and give them actual good advice and resources to help change people's lives. The host, the show's namesake, Dr. Philip McGraw, is now 73 years old, but when the show began in 2002, he was 52. Phil had earned a PhD in clinical psychology in 1979, and throughout the 80s, he was doing a lot of like self-help seminars. He worked a lot with lawyers to psychoanalyze these lawyers' clients and to help get the best chances for them in court based on their mental at the time of committing the crime. Before he was a TV doctor, he did a lot of different like psychology jobs, high-paying, well-respected psychology jobs. And then in the early 90s, Phil had his first TV doctor appearance on Oprah Winfrey. And as a guest on her show, he would do essentially what he went on to do with his own show, which was like psychoanalyze people and give them life advice. Phil was soon offered his very own spin-off TV show that ran for 21 years straight with over 3,500 episodes, which is insane. But famously, it ceased production just last year in 2023. And you know what? Had it not been for all of their controversies, I'm sure that the Dr. Phil show would still be going, and it would be going up until that man dies. Like, that show was really, really popular. On his show, Dr. Phil had a lot of range in the kind of guests that he would get on. The show would cover a range of different topics, a lot of them quite normal, like family drama issues, similar to Danielle Bregoli's. I mean, hers is quite an extreme case, but the general idea of the show was for it to be like quite relatable, for one family or one person to go up with one issue, and then when Dr. Phil solves that one, it can apply to other people in the audience that might be going through something similar. But a huge element of the Dr. Phil show were the different kinds of stories that it would bring in. Like, Phil would sit there and speak to kidnapping victims or ex-criminals or even like celebrity cases. There was actually a lot of controversy when Phil had Shelley Duvall on his show, and she was clearly quite mentally ill at the time, and a lot of people were saying that the show was just kind of exploiting her current mental state. But by far, the biggest controversy to come out of the Dr. Phil show was when everyone found out that for most of the time that the show was running, Dr. Phil wasn't actually a real licensed doctor. Well, he does have a doctorate in clinical psychology, like we said earlier, but after 2006, he stopped renewing his license, which meant that he couldn't practice psychology on people. He wasn't an active doctor. So from that point on, he was just an entertainer, first and foremost. That's how he saw himself in his eyes, and that's how I guess the producers of the show saw him. But the public and everyone that had been enjoying the Dr. Phil show felt deceived, almost. Is that the word to use? Because, yeah, we'd all been watching this show thinking we were getting genuine life advice from an actual practicing doctor. That was the whole selling point of the show, wasn't it, after all? And so everyone felt lied to. Everyone felt deceived by Dr. Phil and by the whole show that they had loved for the past 20 years. On the show, Dr. Phil claimed to be an emotional compass who pointed his guests in the right direction, and he would do it all in front of a live studio audience. And that's one part of this whole thing that I've never really understood. Like, there's some shows that would really benefit from a live studio audience, you know, like talk show panel kind of things where they're talking about light-hearted debates and comedic things, not people going through their deepest, darkest family trauma. Like, what the fuck is the need for the live studio audience? Feels very counterproductive to me to bring in a load of strangers and have them like boo and laugh and cheer at you, like digging up the deepest, darkest parts of your psyche. That's so inappropriate to me. But Barbara Ann, Danielle's mother, felt like this might be the humiliation that Danielle needed to change her ways, to scare her straight. But all of the stuff that we spoke about earlier that Danielle had done in her childhood, stealing the car, running up credit card debt, everything that inspired her mother to call Dr. Phil in the first place was just the beginning. Danielle's behaviour only seemed to get worse and worse once the TV camera crews were brought in. Phil actually organised for a crew to go to Florida where Danielle and her mother lived, and they were going to pick up a load of footage of their day-to-day life, like get in their environment and see how they interact with each other. And it was just as Barbara Ann had described. Danielle was filmed twerking, smoking, and physically fighting her mother. And just before the crew packed up all their cameras to fly back to California, Danielle topped it all off by stealing one of the crew members' cars. This woman was a makeup artist for the Dr. Phil team. She'd left her bag in another room, and she said that the keys were right at the bottom of that bag. So Danielle had gone in the bag while no one was in there and dug around for these keys. She knew that she was looking to steal a car. But once she'd managed to get hold of these keys, Danielle was very discreet about all of this. She snuck out of the house while her mum and her grandmother were talking to the team. She hopped a fence and then managed to find this girl's car, jumped in it, and then started to drive away. Meanwhile, one of the neighbours had actually seen her doing this, seen her hopping the fence and jumping in a car, knowing damn well that she's a 13-year-old child. And so they ran straight over to Barbara Ann's house and said, look, I've just seen your daughter. She's on one again. So now her mother, her grandmother, the neighbours, and Dr. Phil's crew are all panicking, thinking, well, how the hell do we safely get this 13-year-old child off of the road without her hurting herself or anyone else? But I mean, luckily, she hadn't actually gotten onto the road just yet. I don't really know where they were. I don't know the layout of Danielle's childhood home and the street that she lived on, sorry. But I think she'd basically gotten the car out of its car parking spot and she was making her way to get out onto the roads. But her grandmother, Barbara, jumped into action. She was going to try and stop her grandchild herself. She ran outside, hopped into her own car, and then drove it into not into the front of the house, but in front of the house to try to block Danielle from actually leaving. But Danielle wasn't having it. She actually reversed into her grandmother's car and started pushing it out of the way until she had enough room to escape down the road and far away from everyone. The car ended up with a huge scrape down the side of it, and the makeup artist's belongings were all still in that car as well. So now that Danielle was gone with it all, she was really worried. Ironically, the makeup artist had locked all of her valuable belongings in her car because she knew that Danielle had a tendency to steal. Of course, how was she supposed to guess that she was going to steal the whole damn car with everything in it? Her purse, her hotel key for that night. Where was she going to stay if Danielle didn't return with the car that night? What was this girl gonna do? The police were contacted, but eventually Danielle drove herself back home at 3 a.m. She'd been gone for about 4 hours, I want to say. She later admitted that she had taken cash right out of the makeup artist's purse. And she said that she'd been rummaging through it with her homeboys. But there was a bit of a discrepancy on the actual Dr. Phil show. Dr. Phil was asking the makeup artist, who was sat in the audience for all of this, by the way, the drama. He asked the makeup artist how much Danielle had stolen, and I can't remember the exact figure, but she said $80 or $100 or something big like that. And Danielle was like, nah, there was only $3 in there. Regardless of how much money was in it, she is still admitting that she stole cash out of this woman's purse. But anyway, even now that Danielle had returned home with the car, she was safe, the car was fine, she still wasn't willing to give over the actual car keys. And I'm not sure why. It was probably a control thing, I guess. While she still had those car keys, she still had the power in this situation. So Danielle comes into the house with the keys still in her hand, and the cameras catch her mum approaching her, throwing her down onto the floor and attempting to grab the keys back off her. And these videos were shown on Dr. Phil. You can hear Barbara Ann shouting at Danielle saying, "You want to play games with me, girl? You want to play games with me?" As she's wrestling her 13-year-old daughter on the floor. It's clear that Barbara Ann isn't afraid to get aggressive and physical right back with her daughter. And I'm not gonna lie, I know that Danielle Bregoli was a little shit. She was. But it does make me very uncomfortable to see any parent being physically aggressive with their child, no matter how unruly your child is. And Danielle was out of control, of course. We all can see that. But dare I say that Barbara Ann's reactions might have perpetuated or even worsened Danielle's bad behaviour. Because children learn from their parents growing up. They learn from examples. And I think that physical aggression, especially to someone smaller and less able to defend themselves, I think that's never a good example to set, especially to your growing children. But anyway, on September 14th, 2006, Danielle Bregoli's episode of Dr. Phil aired with the very chaotic title, "I want to give up my car-stealing, knife-wielding, twerking 13-year-old daughter who tried to frame me for a crime." The way I had to take a breath in the middle of that what the hell? That's longer than a Fall Out Boy song title. So of course Danielle, her mother, and her grandmother were all flown out to the set of Dr. Phil so that they could actually sit there and talk to him. But before we get into the content of the episode, we have to talk about the night before the recording at the hotel. Because Danielle was still at her mother's throat up until the night before the recording. I don't know what they were arguing or fighting over this particular time, but her mother actually had to call the security of the hotel because Danielle was like pinning her down and spitting on her. But anyways, for the actual episode, Barbara Ann is brought out onto the stage first, and she just kind of explains the situation. This is my devil child, and I have tried absolutely everything, and nothing works on her. Not therapy, not getting arrested by the police. She explains that she is just so desperate for someone to help her with her troubled teen. And then Dani herself comes out onto stage. And you can immediately tell that she is nothing like her mother in the way that she speaks and acts and presents herself. Nothing like her. Dani's dad is Jewish and her mum is Italian, but she doesn't sound like either of them at all. Danielle Bregoli quickly became infamous for her black accent. The accent and the dialect just comes out of her so unnaturally and so awkwardly. Dr. Phil actually asked her where she'd picked up this accent from, and she tells him the streets. She speaks in AAVE a lot of the time. That's African American Vernacular English. And it's just like subtle changes that are made to the English language by Black Americans usually. So things like using be for a habitual thing, like she be working or he been working. I just used the exact same example twice. You get what I mean though. And things like double negatives, like he don't know nothing. It's a lot of like subtle things like that, but when they're all used together, it creates its own vernacular. And it's often learned from your family or your community growing up, as all of our accents are, which is why it's so confusing that Danielle has ended up with this accent when she didn't have any close examples of it in her life. It seems that she's just mimicking this way of speaking, probably because she thinks it's cool. And she clearly thinks it makes her sound like she's from the streets, as she said earlier, so maybe there's an element of like her thinking it makes her sound tougher. White people adopting AAVE is quite a common form of cultural appropriation. It's become especially a big thing in the 2010s and the 2020s with a lot of like young people, like teens and young adults adopting it. And it's become a bigger and bigger conversation over the years, with many Black Americans feeling very uncomfortable when white people take on this way of speaking that's not natural to them, especially given that a lot of this language originates from communities of Black slaves only a couple hundred years ago. And if you know anything about Danielle Bregoli's life and her career after her Dr. Phil episode, you know that this is only scratching the surface of that conversation. Cultural appropriation has been such a huge thing, a huge conversation around Danielle Bregoli. But anyway, I've gone on a bit of a tangent again. Let's go back to the Dr. Phil episode. Danielle's sat there and she's like, Phil's asked her to explain the whole car stealing scenario. And at one point she says the sentence, and I quote, "I know where the car at." And here, Dr. Phil spots an opportunity to make fun of Dani and to make the audience laugh. So he calls her out on her grammar. He repeats, "Where the car at?" And then he asked her if she even passed 5th grade, which the whole audience erupts into laughter over. And Danielle tells him, "Well, I stopped at 7th grade if you want to get technical." 7th grade is around 12 or 13 years old. And yeah, she was 13 at the time of filming this episode, so she wasn't in school. The audience are finding this whole conversation hilarious. And Danielle actually calls them out at one point saying, "And all these hoes laughing like there's something funny." Now, Dr. Phil is absolutely baffled by what this 13-year-old child has just said on his stage. He's speechless for a second, and then he goes, "The hoes are laughing?" And she goes, "Yup." He goes, "So the audience are a bunch of hoes?" And she goes, "Yup." Honestly, watching this Dr. Phil episode again in preparation for this video was such a blast from the past. I'm really excited to be talking about like a relic of internet history. So once she's called the audience a bunch of hoes, the camera cuts to them all laughing, and then when it cuts back to Danielle, you can see that she's ready to snap. And then out comes the infamous quote, "Catch me outside, how about that?" Danielle loves this kind of confrontation, and she wants everyone in the audience to believe that she could spring up and start swinging punches at any minute. And at one point, she does actually get out of her chair, walk towards her mum, and like start squaring up to her for a minute, as if she's gonna like actually start physically fighting her own mum on the Dr. Phil set. And Philip is not impressed by this at all. He finally gets Danielle to sit down so that he can break through this tough exterior area. And he's asking her really deep questions like, do you love your mother? When was the last time you saw your father? Did somebody hurt you to make you like this? And by this point, every member of the family is crying on the stage, including Danielle. Dr. Phil points out that Danielle's bad behaviour is clearly just a very self-destructive coping mechanism that she has developed to help her deal with all of the hardships she's been through in life. After being abandoned by her father as a baby and then her mother going through 2 rounds of cancer, Danielle always had the threat of being abandoned completely in life if her mother was to die. And this is quite a common response for children that have been abandoned by a parent when they were very young. They will self-sabotage and destroy the good things in their life before they can get hurt by losing them. It's a reflex that maybe helps us feel a bit more in control of when things leave our lives. You can't be abandoned if you wreck the connection in the first place, right? And so Dr. Phil theorizes that Danielle and her mother used to be super, super close. And that's something that Danielle admits there on that stage, that she loves her mum so much. But the worse her mother's cancer got and the longer the threat of losing her was imminent, Danielle starts to put up these walls. She started to ruin this amazing relationship that she had with her mother, because if she was to suddenly lose her from cancer when they were so close, it would shatter her whole entire world. But if she pushed her mother away while she still could, while she was still alive, then maybe one day when she does get the unfortunate news that mum's passed away, then it might be easier for her to deal with. Dr. Phil even pointed out that there's evidence that Danielle doesn't really hate her mother. Of course, she slept in the same bed with her mum most nights, even at 13 years old. Even the night before recording the Dr. Phil show, they slept in the same hotel bed, cuddled up together. Danielle would be this terribly angry, aggressive, volatile person throughout the day, but then most evenings she would crawl into bed with mummy and cuddle her, and I think that speaks volumes. Danielle was still that scared little girl on the inside. She would push her mother away during the day, push her away severely, but then she would run back to her regularly to make sure that she still loved her and make sure that mummy was still there. It's a really sad realization moment for the show, that this girl that everyone had loved to hate for the last 40 minutes was actually just a damaged, scared little girl. But of course, her behaviour was still criminal at the end of the day, and Dr. Phil reminded Danielle that throughout the course of the conversation that they had just recorded to go on TV, she had confessed to several crimes on camera. If his makeup artist decided to press charges against Danielle for stealing her car, then there is a good chance that she could have been tried as an adult. Even though she was 13. She would get a hefty prison sentence that would lock her away for maybe the rest of her teenage years. But there was still one more option. It didn't have to be jail for Danielle, because there was someone else sitting in the Dr. Phil audience that day that was eager to speak with Danielle, a supposed expert in troubled teens just like her. Her name was Kristen Hayes, and she'd worked with Dr. Phil before in the past. She was the outreach director of Turnabout Ranch, which was, quote, a therapeutic boarding school in a tiny town in Utah called Escalating. It's not exactly clear when the partnership started between Turnabout Ranch and the Dr. Phil show, but Turnabout Ranch said on their website that they'd had a long-standing relationship with the show. Whatever that means. This therapeutic boarding school advertised itself as a working cattle ranch. So on top of the usual school classes and the therapy sessions, Danielle would also be getting her hands dirty. And Kristen was offering to take Danielle Bregoli out to Utah, out to Turnabout Ranch, then and there. Once recording this episode had wrapped, they would put her in a car and she could go out to Utah then. So Dr. Phil gives Danielle a choice. She can either take the risk of jail and see if she really was tough enough, or she could go with Kristen to Turnabout Ranch, 600 miles away from her mother. Danielle chose the ranch, and the audience burst into applause. Now, before we get into Danielle's specific experience of Turnabout Ranch, let's have a look at how these sort of camps work in general. Because in the US, the industry around, quote-unquote, helping these troubled teens and sending them to honestly quite inhumane camps like this is absolutely huge. There are over 6,000 privately run troubled teen centers in the US, and this industry makes over $20 billion a year. These sort of facilities started to become popular in the 60s and 70s as a preventative measure to keep kids out of jail. They hoped if they could correct bad behaviors before they became criminal, well, then that's even better, isn't it? You save a lot of money on prisons and police and just general bad shit happening. But right from the very start, when this industry began, it was always incredibly sketchy. One of the very early pioneers of these kind of treatment methods was a man named Charles Diedrich in the late 1950s. After attending Alcoholics Anonymous meetings, Diedrich realized that drug addicts weren't always welcomed into their kind of meetings because drug addicts' problems were often very different to the problems of alcoholics. And so he came up with his own program specifically for drug addicts called Synanon. He wanted to help get people clean, but his methods were very, very extreme, to say the least. Synanon specialized in attack therapy, which, just the name alone, you know this is about to be fucking horrid. It was essentially like evil group therapy, you know, where everyone just like sits around and talks about their feelings and they share it all with each other. Well, this is evil version of that. It would basically be like someone would sit there and say how they'd gotten into their situation, how they started the drugs and how their addiction worsened, and then everyone around them would sit there and verbally abuse them and tell them it was their fault and that they're weak and this and that. All the most awful things you could think to say to someone in such a deep hole of drug addiction. And when we were researching for this video and I first found out about attack therapy, I was like, how the fuck is that ever supposed to help anyone? Turns out that the idea is that addicts build up very strong mental defenses to justify their actions. And so the point of getting all of these people to like break them down is, well, exactly that, to break down all of these defenses that they've built over the years of being an addict. But of course, it was complete pseudoscience. I can't imagine this did actually help very many people. There were studies done into it in the 90s that said, yeah, it might have helped some drug addicts that already had like really high self-esteem, but for the rest of them, it would have been even more traumatizing. Like, it would have made matters worse. People accepted into the Synanon program really had to commit themselves to this experience. Women were forced to shave their heads. Men were forced to have vasectomies. It's insane. And Synanon only grew and grew and grew. People loved this for some reason. Then, after about 10 years of this, 10 years of working with drug-addicted adults, Diedrich realized that he could change the world if he started even earlier, if he started with children. And so with that, Synanon bases were set up in schools now with a lot of the same therapy techniques, like attack therapy. These poor little kids, like, bullying each other as a form of therapy. But as Synanon was growing and growing and growing, it suddenly started getting a lot of allegations from all different Synanon programs across the country. Allegations of abuse of all kinds, violence, abduction. Children would often escape from these Synanon camps with clear signs of physical abuse, but they would either get sent straight back or just completely ignored. Synanon eventually went bankrupt in 1991 after all of the negative publicity and the lawsuits, but a lot of Charles Diedrich's ideas survived. Many of his followers actually went on to create their own treatment centers for troubled teens, and they used a lot of the same tactics. They would completely isolate these children, make them do back-breaking manual labor, an exhausting amount of classes. And remember I said they were all privately run as well, so parents were paying anywhere from $1,000 to $10,000 a month to put their kids in these awful, awful situations. And of course, if you're a troubled teen and you grow suspicious that you're going to get sent to a place like this, say you overhear a conversation between mum and dad, I think most troubled teens would try to fight the idea of that. They would either argue with their parents or run away, something. But don't worry, the troubled teen industry had thought of a solution for that. There were escorting companies. There are dozens of these companies throughout America that all use very similar strategies. They will turn up to the kid's house in the middle of the night, go into their bedroom while they're sleeping, wake them up, and immediately bundle them into a car and take them to their behaviour correctional facility. Sometimes the kids won't be allowed to get dressed or go to the bathroom before they're put in the car. Sometimes they're even handcuffed. Actually, sometimes even handcuffed. The parents are always in on this plan because, let's be real, it's the parents that have organised it. But a lot of the time, the kid is completely unaware. I mean, of course, that's the whole idea of this situation. It's only going to work if they have no idea. And even like their siblings, the parents won't tell the siblings because obviously the siblings might tell the troubled teen. So then imagine being this troubled teen's like 7-year-old younger sibling and you're watching your sister get kidnapped in the night by some strange men. What the fuck? Just imagine what it must be like for that teenager though. Like an actual kidnapping simulation being sprung on you in the middle of the night out of nowhere, and your parents are standing by watching this happen and not doing anything to help you. You would be so confused and betrayed and scared. You're just thrown in the back of a car. A lot of the time they don't know where they're going. They're not told where they're going. They just know that they're going away and their life is about to change. I know a bunch of you have seen the new series on Netflix called The Program. Don't worry, I have seen all of your messages requesting a video like this. And that series follows a woman named Catherine and her former classmates from a behaviour modification facility in New York called Academy at Ivy Ridge. Catherine was sent there in 2004 at the age of 15. She had fallen down a very dark path of drugs and alcohol to deal with the death of her mother. At this point, when she was 15, she had a new stepmother, but this stepmother didn't like how disruptive Catherine was, and they felt that they needed to do something about it. They came across promotional videos for Academy at Ivy Ridge, and it seemed great. The videos showed all the kids enjoying like outdoor activities and making new friends. But what Ivy Ridge presented to the outside world couldn't be more different to what it was actually like for the kids. The moment that Catherine stepped inside the facility, she was forcibly stopped from walking back out of that door again to go and collect the rest of her things. That was it now. She belonged to them. In Ivy Ridge, there was a points-based system that punished the kids for not sticking to the rules. Rules like walking in straight lines everywhere you go. They also weren't allowed to speak to the other kids. They weren't allowed to look out of the window a lot of the time. But the thing that really disgusted me more than anything else is that they would sometimes have to use the bathroom with the stall door open so that a member of staff could keep an eye on them at all times. How fucking disgusting is that? No privacy. These are kids as well. I find that very icky. There needs to be some fucking checks going on at places like this, you know? Ivy Ridge was part of a wider network of facilities called the Worldwide Association of Specialty Programs and Schools, or WASP for short. Almost all of the schools and camps under this WASP umbrella have faced allegations of abuse. And in 2004, when Catherine was at Ivy Ridge, their sister school in Mexico was actually raided by police because of these allegations. So what happened to all of the kids in this Mexico school when it was shut down? Were they sent back home to their families? You would hope. But that's not what happened, because all of these facilities are so connected, and because they're all privately run, one of them gets shut down, that doesn't matter. Just transfer all the kids to a different school. So that's exactly what happened. All of the kids from this school in Mexico were flown to New York to then join Ivy Ridge, and now Ivy Ridge was so overpopulated. There was a girl that Catherine met from the Mexico school that had actually been sent to her original camp because she was a heroin addict, and when she first arrived, the camp had stripped her naked and shut her in a room so that she would forcibly detox all on her own for a few days. And yeah, now her school's been raided and they've all been sent hundreds of miles away up to New York. And this sudden overcrowding meant that students were sleeping in hallways, and they all had to have their wrists outstretched so that the camp workers could check that they weren't harming themselves, because that would actually lose them points in the program. It's so dystopian. They genuinely don't seem to actually care about the root of these kids' bad behavior. They just care about eradicating the symptoms of whatever's going on in their mental. Only by following all of their rules and completing all of their seminars could you graduate from the program. And of course, the longer it took for these kids to graduate the program, the longer they would have to stay at Ivy Ridge, the longer their parents would be paying these abusive camp workers to keep abusing their kids. Some of the women that Catherine interviewed in the program claim that they were subjected to violent restraints and sexual abuse from the staff at Ivy Ridge. The treatment of the kids there got so bad that at one point a riot broke out within the boys section of the school, and over 30 kids were arrested just for trying to escape this camp that's abusing them. Amid all of the allegations of constant neglect and psychological torture, Ivy Ridge was shut down for good in 2009. But so many others remain active and taking in new kids literally as we speak. Survivors of these camps are constantly coming out trying to raise awareness to put a stop to them. And one of those activists is actually icon living legend Paris Hilton. She has been very vocal about her traumatic experiences at 4 separate behaviour correctional facilities. As a teenager, Paris was unruly. She was always sneaking out of the house to go and party and drink underage. Her parents couldn't control her, and they said they were actually really scared for the path that she was taking in life. She was making friends with some seedy people, and they just didn't like where it was going. They knew they needed to get her some sort of help, and so one day they decided that they were just going to throw a bunch of their money at the problem and send her away. So one night, when Paris was 16 years old, she was awoken in the middle of the night by 2 men towering over her. They told her to get dressed, and then they put her in a car and drove her away. The next morning, Paris's little sister wakes up in their house, and obviously Paris is nowhere to be seen. So she goes and speaks to her parents and asks where she is, and they don't tell her. Like, they won't tell her where Paris has gone. They just kind of acted as if nothing had happened. The 4th and final camp that Paris Hilton was sent to was Provo Canyon School in Utah, and this one is infamous. This is where a lot of her bad experiences were concentrated. She developed lifelong PTSD after a range of horrific experiences, from strip searches to solitary confinement, being drugged with like unknown substances. They were just given tablets and told to swallow them. They didn't know what they were taking. Even though Paris's family was very rich and respected and famous, they were in the public eye, even their children were not safe or protected from this rotten industry. And because all of these camps are privately run, that means there's no real government oversight or regulation. And it makes it even harder for people to like check on these camps because they're all out in the middle of nowhere, just in some random fucking desert in Utah. That's all part of it, isolating these kids far away from society. And that also means that the police and anyone that's suspicious of the camp can't be asked going out to check on it. And that brings us back to Danielle Bregoli, who was sent out 600 miles away to Turnabout Ranch in Utah in 2016. Danielle's story is very similar to the women that we've just talked about, although she didn't vocalize how abusive and traumatic the whole situation had been for her until a little while later, when she'd processed it all a bit more. Remember, she was only 13 at the time. So on the surface, when she first came out of that camp, no one knew that she had had such an awful time. She spent 6 months at the ranch in total, and she graduated at the end of it as she was supposed to. All of the staff said that they were super happy with her progress. Then pretty quickly after she was released from the ranch, Danielle and her mother were invited back on the Dr. Phil show to give everyone an update. And towards the end of Danielle's time at Turnabout, the Dr. Phil show had even sent out another camera crew to go and snap some videos of her like feeding the horse and doing some manual work, doing her classes. You know, just examples of her doing really well on Turnabout Ranch. And in these clips, Danielle seems like a completely different girl. She is calm, she's happy. It seemed like the program had worked. On this second episode of Dr. Phil, one of the camp counselors was actually in the audience, and Danielle thanked him personally. But there was something about the way that she was reacting to people's questions and comments this time around. I felt like her energy was considerably different, which I guess it was kind of supposed to be. In the first episode, she was out of control and aggressive. Of course, we were trying to change that. There's just something about the way that she's reacting this time. She's a lot more like to herself, and she's looking away from people a lot more, and she doesn't say much, but it's like the things that she does say, it's almost as if you can tell that she wanted to say something else but stopped herself. I don't know, maybe I'm reading into it a little bit too much, but we'll come back to that later. Because no, I'm not reading into it too much. Spoiler alert, I'm right. But let's just talk about what Danielle must have been going through at that moment of the second Dr. Phil episode. How mad must it be for her to have come out of that ranch and back to America, and she is the main character of the internet? Oh my god. While she'd been gone, that Dr. Phil episode had gone viral. Someone had made a chart-topping song out of her Dr. Phil episode. They'd taken sound bites of her most popular, like, catchphrases. Of course, Catch Me Outside, How About That? But there's a really funny part of that song with the hoes are laughing. Yup. I love that part of it. I've been quoting that all week. But at this point in time, everyone was talking about Danielle Bregoli. And they weren't being very nice about her. The general consensus on the internet was that people didn't like her. They made fun of her in so many different ways, whether it was about her appearance or her intelligence. It was just as if people forgot that she was a child with feelings, and she was going to read all this and she was going to be affected by it. People treated her like the internet's punching bag. And so far, Danielle hadn't seen any benefits really for all of this infamy. I mean, she had a few followers on Instagram now, but I don't believe she was making money off of that song. I think the guy that remixed it, I think he kept all the money. But there was one man that had been watching Danielle go viral. He was a record producer, and he thought that she had a lot of potential in the music industry, all because of this persona that everyone had bought into so much. People love a villain, someone that doesn't care who they upset or who they offend. He had a vision of turning this street-talking 13-year-old into a rap sensation. So within months of returning from Turnabout Ranch, Danielle Bregoli was reborn as Bhad Bhabie. And that's spelled nothing like how it sounds. Bad is spelled with a H. Try and guess where the H is. If you don't already know, where would you guess? Where would you guess that the H goes? It goes second. B-H-A-D, B-H-A-B-I-E. Bhad Bhabie. I personally like it, but I think it's sick, but I also can acknowledge that it's also mental. But apparently, it's not just for like visuals and to make it a bit more unique. Apparently, BAD with a H, B-H-A-D, is actually an acronym. Danny says that it's short for Been Hated and Doubted. Less than a year after her first appearance on Dr. Phil, Danielle Bregoli, well, Bhad Bhabie, released her first ever single titled These Hoes. You know what? It's a banger. Like, you know what? I'm gonna admit this. I genuinely like Bhad Bhabie music. God, arrest me. Oh, sorry that I have fun. I enjoy fun. But These Hoes, her first song, again, spelt weird. Hose is spelt H-E-A-U-X. What? But anyway, this song is exactly what you imagined a Bhad Bhabie song to be. It's edgy, it's explicit. In the music video, there's a bunch of like suburban mums protesting against Bhad Bhabie. It's like, mums against Bhad Bhabie. And I love that. By now, Danielle knows the reputation that she's got. She knows that people think she's a bad influence. But she de gaff. She won the IDGAF Awards. Like, she doesn't care. That's who she is, and she's gonna keep being like that. Danielle Bregoli actually became the youngest ever female rapper to make the charts in the US. She was just 14 years old. And she wasn't even finished there. In 2018, she released her debut album, 15, and it had a bunch of star features on it. Ty Dolla $ign, Lil Yachty. She was brushing shoulders with some of the biggest stars in rap. All because her mum dragged her on the Dr. Phil show one day because she was a bad kid. But Danielle was a tiger, finding it very difficult to change her stripes. She was still just as confrontational, volatile, and aggressive as she'd always been, even in these more exclusive, famous, professional circles. She had beef with so many people publicly, one of which was actually Iggy Azalea, and she threw a drink at her at Cardi B's party one time. I thought that was mad, but actually a lot of the beef that Danielle Bregoli had was with people her own age, other like hated internet teens, which is such a sad niche, by the way. That's awful. But when I start naming them, you'll know what I mean. People like Lil Tay and Whoa Vicky. She was always scrapping with these girls online. And then she got into some beef with Sky Jackson. Do you remember the girl from Jessie? And this Sky Jackson beef has layers to it. It's like a lasagna of an argument. The groundwork was laid in 2018 when Danielle didn't know Sky yet at this point. She was just 15 years old, 2 years into her fame, but 1 year into making music. So she was very new to the music industry. She was making connections, meeting the other people that were popping in the scene at the time. And she met fellow rapper NBA Youngboy, who was 18 at the time when he and 15-year-old Danielle started a romantic relationship. Now, I know there's not that many years between 15 and 18, but that is the difference between a legal adult over the age of consent and a child that is under the age of consent. It's not right. This relationship was not right. And no wonder Barbara Ann was so protective of Danielle. She was now hanging around with these older boys that famously got up to no good. They confessed about everything in their rap lyrics. NBA Youngboy had actually been incarcerated for attempted murder before. He had just opened fire on a group of people and shot at them. No one died, but of course he got attempted murder for that. That's insane. That among many other things. Loads of different assault cases, weapons charges. He always had guns on him. He got done for domestic violence against his ex-girlfriend. And now he was dating a child, 15-year-old Danielle Bregoli. They weren't together for too long, and when they did break up, this is where the Sky Jackson beef comes in, by the way, but I thought it was quite important to give you the context about this boyfriend, because it freaked me out when I read about it. But anyway, Danielle and NBA Youngboy have broken up. So NBA Youngboy is technically single, and Sky Jackson goes on her Instagram story and she's talking about how she has a crush on him and she wants someone to set her up with him. And Danielle did not like that. She was fuming and she started publicly beefing Sky, making posts on social media and even terrorizing her offline to the point where Sky Jackson actually got a restraining order against Bhad Bhabie. Dani was just an absolute liability when it came to her behaviour. You couldn't take her anywhere. Actually, you couldn't take her anywhere. She would kick up a fuss any place, anytime, with anyone. Now that she was famous, she had a manager and a full-time bodyguard. Of course she did, with the kind of shit she was getting herself into on a regular basis. Of course she needed protection. All of her staff must have been tearing their hair out, trying to keep control of this girl. But I guess she was paying their wages. 3 years after her appearance on Dr. Phil, Danielle was now 16 years old, and she was given her very own Snapchat show. It was a reality series named Bringing Up Baby, and the premise was that Danielle was still a wild child that still had to be tamed, and so this series was going to follow her mother, Barbara Ann, and her bodyguard, Frank, as they tried to get a hold of this unruly teen. And it became very apparent through this series that nothing had really changed for Danielle in the way of her behaviour, or in the way of her relationship with her mother. That was still as volatile as it always had been as well. They fought about everything, from Danielle's beef with other rappers to her performance schedule, even the fact that Danielle seemed to like her bodyguard, Frank, more than she liked her own mother. She starts to see Frank as the father figure that she never had, and this actually causes quite a bit of tension between her and her mum. I think her mum gets a bit jealous, but I don't know, I feel good for Danielle. I think she needs that. I think that's really healthy, and that I'm glad she found a relationship like that in her life. That's nice. And you might be thinking, well, why is her mum still so involved in her career? If they don't like each other and they're still arguing all the time, they're each other's worst enemy, surely they'd want some time away from each other. Why are they still spending every single day together? If Barbara Ann wanted to, I'm sure she would have been able to sign some kind of parental consent forms to let Danielle do all her touring and all of her work with her bodyguard Frank, who she likes. Surely she would have been happy to be left in his I want to say possession, in his care, in his possession. But Barbara Ann didn't want to just sign some waiver and then send her daughter off. She wanted to be involved in this. And I think there's a few reasons for this. Of course, at the end of the day, despite their long-running feud, this is still her daughter, her only child, her flesh and blood, and she loved Danielle. And of course, she would just want to spend time with her. But also, another huge factor of this is that 16-year-old Danielle was now the breadwinner of the family. And this is before she was even an adult as well. So naturally, Barbara Ann had to be in control of Danielle's finances. I think that's a big part of the reason that her mum was so involved in her career when she was a teenager. And as far as we're aware, there was no funny business when it came to like the managing of Danielle's money. You know how some parents of child stars can be about that? They feel very entitled to keep and spend the money that their child has earned. I don't think any of that was going on with Barbara Ann. Just want to clarify that. But of course, because Barbara Ann was in charge of like Danny's financial life, it made sense for her to be there with her almost every day whenever she was going out to different jobs and different gigs. Her mum was almost like another manager for her, kind of. But aside from her obligations, there were also a lot of upsides to this for Barbara Ann. There were trips out to LA, she got to meet famous people, go to exclusive events. Her mum got to experience all the best parts of Danny's fame and her career. And don't get me wrong, their relationship was still very tumultuous, years out from the Dr. Phil show. The Snapchat show Bringing Up Baby demonstrates this very well. They still weren't getting along. But I think deep down, Barbara Ann felt just the same as Danny did. Do you remember how we were talking about when Danny would be mean and evil during the day, but then she would crawl into bed with her mum and cuddle her at night? Well, I think Barbara Ann was kind of the same. They would fight and bicker and be at each other's throats all day because they knew that it would be fine in the end. And neither of them is ever going to abandon the other one. Barbara Ann loved her daughter. And of course, she wanted to be by her side, holding her hand, cheering her on for this insane career that just kind of landed on her doorstep. What a crazy life for a 16-year-old. In fact, now that her daughter was so famous, well, infamous and actually hated by quite a lot of the world, Barbara Ann felt even more of a duty to be there with her. She wanted to protect her baby from all of this hate that she was receiving for honestly not that much reason. I mean, you could kind of understand people having something to say about her behaviour, like on the Dr. Phil show and about how she treated her mum. I can imagine there being some sort of hate comments around that, but Danny was getting all sorts of awful comments, sexualizing her as a child, making fun of her appearance, ripping her to shreds. I think we really need to deep how well Danielle actually did for taking on all of this, especially coming out of Turnabout Ranch and suddenly the whole world hates you and has made fun of you online. That would destroy most people. But Danny just kind of fed into it and used it to build up her career. I think that's amazing. For a teenager, a young teenager as well, to be able to view a situation like that in a positive light and say like, okay, I'm going to prove them all wrong and I'm going to go out and be talented and famous and I'm going to make something of myself. That's amazing. Just after the start of the pandemic in June 2020, Danielle actually checked herself into rehab for 30 days for what her team described as childhood trauma and an addiction to prescription pills. For the first time since she shot to fame in 2016, Bhad Bhabie had gone quiet on socials. She was working herself, giving herself some peace and privacy, finally getting to the root of all of these mental issues that she'd clearly had since a child. But she did that time in rehab and she hasn't said much more about it online. I think, of course, that kind of thing, if someone wants to keep it private, they have every right to keep it private. I just hope it was a very enriching and healing experience for her. But anyway, she was back to the internet in October of 2020 when she came back with a new song, Do It Like Me, which is a bop. It's been in my playlist. That song actually went viral on TikTok as well, apparently, and had like loads of other famous people lip syncing along to it. By this point, Danielle Bregoli had been famous for 5 years, and she's only just about to turn an adult. How crazy is that timeline? She had gone from a ranch in the middle of nowhere to touring the world with her music. Danielle turned 18 in March of 2021, but 1 month prior to that, a huge bombshell was dropped in the news. Not by Danny, but it did have everything to do with her. A girl named Hannah Archuleta came out in the news with a terrible experience that she had had at Turnabout Ranch when she was a kid. And just like Danielle Bregoli, Hannah had been sent to Turnabout Ranch after appearing on the Dr. Phil show. Hannah alleges that she was transported to the ranch against her will, and within the first 2 weeks of being there, she was sexually assaulted by one of the camp workers, an older man molested her in a barn. She was scared to speak up about what she'd experienced, but eventually she went and told one of the other camp workers who, instead of doing anything about it, instead of helping her, instead of reporting it even higher, they punished Hannah for daring to speak up against one of the camp workers. They forced her to go out and labour with the horses for hours in the freezing cold, and that night she was made to sleep on nothing but a wooden plank. Because she had been assaulted. What the fuck? All that while her abuser is actively being protected and allowed to still work with all of these kids. There was no one over the age of 18 in those camps, so it horrifies me that there was sexual assaults going on actually quite regularly. And that's not just about Turnabout Ranch. When I say sexual assaults were going on regularly, I mean just across these camps in general, across America. So many of them have these allegations. It's horrifying. There was no one at these camps that the kids could actually trust and actually confide in. All of the adults were working together and covering for each other. It was kids versus the adults. And who was going to believe the kids? And what makes it even more scary is that this was all in the middle of nowhere as well. There wasn't even another trusted adult for miles. 2 years after leaving Turnabout Ranch, Hannah was 19 years old when she sued both the ranch and Dr. Phil, accusing them both of protecting her abuser. Hannah was motivated to come forward about her experiences after watching a documentary that Paris Hilton had made on her life, and there was an extended section of this documentary about Paris's experiences at those 4 different facilities that she was sent to. And Paris genuinely believed that she was being kidnapped. That first time she was taken to one of these facilities and those men woke her up in her bed telling her to get dressed, that they were going, she thought she was going to die. And the brutality only gets worse from there. Paris has actually described Provo Canyon as the worst of the worst. That was the 4th and final one that she went to. She said that that was where they gave the kids pills that made them feel tired and numb. And it really scared her being drugged up like that. She didn't know what she was on. She knew that she didn't have full control over her body, and so she would try to avoid taking them. But on the occasion that the camp would find out she was lying and that she'd hidden the pills, she would get thrown in solitary confinement. The kids were so worn down by all of this treatment that a lot of them were actually on suicide watch. How fucked up is that? These workers know that what they're doing and how they're treating these kids is making them suicidal, yet nothing is changing. That doesn't make them want to change their actions and be better. At that point, why are you not sending the child home? Why is the child still on the ranch, still being put through these grueling manual labor sessions and just put on suicide watch? It's inhumane. Oh my god, I'm sorry, I need to calm down. That's so fucked up to me. At Provo Canyon, between 2011 and 2014, there were dozens of assaults reported, and a lot of the time the police were coming out to this ranch and not really doing anything about it. Oh, was it a ranch? I think Provo Canyon was more of just a school. In fact, it was called a mental health facility, which is brave. But yeah, there were dozens of cases of assault at Provo Canyon and 25 cases of sexual assault in just 3 years, just between 2011 and 2014. And that is so disgusting because, let me remind you, these are all kids. There is no one over the age of 18 in these camps. They are all from the age of 8 to 17. Children were being sent away by their parents to these camps in the middle of nowhere to be put in the hands of these cruel, abusive paedophiles that took advantage of them. Many survivors of camps like this say that it has affected their life completely, irreversibly. They had gotten used to such aggressive, unkind treatment, and they were always told that it was for their best and it was what they needed and this was what was going to fix them. So then, as adults, they find themselves in bad situations like abusive relationships, for example, because they're used to always being treated like shit by people around them and being controlled. This is normal to them. As a child, they were taught that this is what love is. Love is your parents sending you away to this awful place because they care about you and they only want what's best for you. But all it did was damage them psychologically beyond repair. They were physically abused, psychologically abused. So then, of course, as an adult, it is going to be so hard to tease out the difference between love and abuse. And this happened to Paris Hilton as well. Throughout her 20s and 30s, she said that she was in at least 5 different physically abusive relationships. It's only now that she's actually settled down with a nice husband and a child. She has a nice life now. And it's only now that she actually feels safe and secure enough to actually come out and talk about all of these experiences publicly. After hiding these emotional scars for so long, Paris's documentary ends with her coming clean to her mum about everything that she experienced, because I don't think her parents really knew much of it. In her memoir, Paris explains that the first time she was ever sent to one of these camps, it was actually by her parents, obviously, but on the advice of a therapist. A therapist had told her parents to do this, that this was going to be a good idea, that this was going to be good for their daughter. Of course you want to trust the advice of a licensed therapist. And these are the Hiltons as well, so this has got to be some fucking major therapist, like mega super therapist. The best in the business, surely. So you would believe what they're telling you is the best thing. But they later learned that that therapist was actually earning a commission on the amount of children that they sent to these abusive camps. How fucked up. It makes me ill how deep this goes and how far spread it is. It's all over America, and so many people are in on it and voluntarily keep sending children to go get abused and traumatized. Therapists are supposed to put their patients' well-being and their best interests at the forefront of their care suggestions, but instead, these professionals, I don't even want to call them professionals. They don't even deserve to be called professionals. If they're taking bribes from abusive institutions like this to send patients their way, they should have their fucking license stripped, shouldn't they? But the workers in these industries would always assure the parents that everything was fine and that their children were making good progress. All it was going to take was a few more months in the program, a few more months of pay, that is. And then they'd be all good, and then they'd be sorted out, and then they'd be fixed. When in fact, these parents are handing over this money thinking it's going to help their child, but instead it's just traumatizing them for life. But let's take it back for a second to the star of this episode, Danielle Bregoli. When she came back for that second episode of Dr. Phil to give an update on her experience, she said that she'd had a decent experience at Turnabout Ranch. I mean, she was still Danielle Bregoli and she was still quite unwilling to talk to Dr. Phil all that much. But overall, the things that she said about the ranch seemed positive. But then, 5 years later, when Hannah Archuleta came out about her experience at Turnabout Ranch, this gave Danielle the courage to speak out about the darker parts of what she'd experienced. She hadn't said anything bad about Turnabout Ranch when she was on the Dr. Phil show, or at all for that matter. She'd never said anything bad about the ranch. And maybe that's because she felt like she couldn't. She was still a child, after all. And not just any child, a troubled teen. One that is not very trustworthy in the first place, and she knew that. And on top of that, in that second episode of Dr. Phil, there was one of her camp counsellors sat in the audience watching her speak. Dr. Phil is sat right there, her mum is right there, all the producers, everyone that sent her to that ranch is standing around her, waiting to hear a really good experience come out of her mouth. And so she did. She said that it was really good. I tried to put myself in that situation, and even as a 25-year-old woman, I would probably go along with it and be like, yeah, it was the best experience of my life. Never mind a 13, 14-year-old girl being sat up there. You would feel very pressured to just go along with it and say whatever you think the showrunners and Dr. Phil would want you to say right now. But then, on the 19th of March, 2021, Danielle Bregoli, now aged 18, released a YouTube video on her Bhad Bhabie channel, although this wasn't her usual music video. This video was in collaboration with a group that Paris Hilton is a part of called Breaking Code Silence. They've been active since 2018 to try to put an end to these abusive, traumatizing camps. They actually started reporting on gay conversion camps in the US, and since then they've become an official non-profit organization telling people's stories like Danielle, helping to raise awareness of all sorts of inhumane camps and facilities and put a stop to all of them, not just ones for troubled teens, but ones for all kinds of people. And in this very professional 8-minute YouTube video, Danielle Bregoli lays out her experience of the abuse that she suffered and witnessed at Turnabout Ranch. Danny says that when she arrived, she was made to sit in this circle of rocks, almost like that was going to be her enclosure. There was no indoor section. In fact, there was just a little teepee but it wasn't even a whole teepee. It was like half of it had been cut off. So there was no privacy. Everyone could see inside this teepee. I think it was just in case it rained. They'd be able to sit like kind of just underneath it and get a bit of shelter. But it meant that the camp workers could see Danielle at all times. There was no hiding in there. Danielle said that when you first arrive at Turnabout Ranch, she had to do this. All the other kids had to do this. They were made to sit there in that like rock circle with half a teepee for 3 days straight, where they weren't allowed to shower or socialize or even sleep. That's right. She said that she almost fell asleep a couple of times while she was sat there, and the camp counselors would yell at her to stay awake. They would make her stand up to wake herself up. How is not sleeping for 3 days gonna help these kids' bad behavior? I mean, it's really not, is it? This is just such an obvious tactic to exhaust the kids and wear them down to make them more compliant for when the rest of the program takes place. On Turnabout Ranch, when kids got into trouble, like if they didn't do their chores or if they questioned the authority of the camp workers, they would be sent for what was called reflection. And everyone dreaded being sent for reflection. This was one of the worst punishments that you could get because you had to do it all on your own. The teens, the kids, would be sent out to like one of the animal enclosures, and they would be made to like scoop up shit and clean it and honestly just pace it for hours on end in the freezing cold. The idea was that having so much alone time in complete silence, all on your own, working hard, would give these kids time to reflect on their bad behavior and change their ways. Even when the kids did follow all of the rules correctly, Danielle said that the staff would sometimes just make up new rules on the spot just to catch them out, just to have an excuse to punish them, which is just so sadistic and unfair. It really makes you question the type of people that are willingly signing up for jobs at these camps. The experience that Danny describes in this video is so far from the footage that we saw on the Dr. Phil show of her on the ranch, you know, trotting about on her horse. And one thing that she points out in this video is that, of course, all of their phones are taken away from them when they go on these ranches, so there's no way for them to be able to document the abuse or to take photos or videos or report anything to tell a loved one. All of the adult staff at these facilities all had the same view of the situation, and that was that the kids needed to learn their lesson. And I don't think they cared how they learned that lesson. Whether it was through trauma, abuse, or completely out of proportion, savage punishments, they were gonna fix these kids, no matter what it takes. But probably the worst thing that happened while Danielle Bregoli was at Turnabout Ranch was the day that one of her fellow troubled teens got done for murder on site. It was December 7th, 2016. Danielle and a few of the other kids were having breakfast when they heard a lot of panic among the staff. They were all yelling back and forth to each other on walkie-talkies. They all seemed very frantic, but Danielle managed to get herself close enough to one of the members of staff so that she could overhear what they were talking about on the walkie-talkies. And it turned out that around 7:30 a.m., one of the students, a 17-year-old boy named Clay, had snapped. He'd been telling the other kids that he wanted to escape the ranch for weeks, but none of them realised that he actually did have a plan cooking up. He waited that morning until a camp worker named Jimmy was doing the usual checks, and when he came over to speak to Claire, he just flipped on it. He pulled out a hidden weapon, a metal bar that he'd been holding behind his back, and he struck 61-year-old Jimmy over the head with it. Jimmy fell to the ground, and Clay just kept on going. He wasn't just trying to get him out of the way, just trying to immobilize him. He was trying to kill him. He continued to beat him over and over and over again with this metal pipe until he just stopped fighting back. Danielle spoke very highly of this camp worker named Jimmy. She said that he was really sweet, which was a lot different to all of the other workers there. But that morning, Jimmy was in the way of Clay's escape, and Clay felt that he had to be taken out. Once Clay had finished savagely beating this man, he pulled a set of car keys out of Jimmy's pocket. Stole his car keys, his murder victim's car keys, by the way. He ran outside to where all of the cars were parked, and he found the right one, jumped in Jimmy's car, put the key in, but he couldn't get it to start. No matter how hard he was trying, this car was not going to go anywhere. Frustrated with this sudden obstacle, Clay knew that he had to try again. He had to go back to Turnabout Ranch and find a different camp worker and maybe beat them to death to steal their keys. He burst into one of the nearest cabins and found a female camp worker this time and started beating her over the head with the same metal bar. This camp worker's name was Alicia, and there's some conflicting reports. I think she managed to get away from him at one point, and she locked herself in a cabin with a few other kids, and he kind of ran back after her. At this point, she was covered in blood, and he's banging on the door saying, "Give me the car keys or I'm gonna kill you all." Alicia really didn't want to throw her car keys out of the window. I mean, of course she wasn't going to open the door. They'd managed to lock him outside, but he just wasn't leaving them alone. And I mean, they were safe at this point in time, but he was threatening violence against them if he didn't get these car keys. And so all of the other students were just begging Alicia to throw him the car keys out of the window, just give him what he wants and he'll go away. But of course she knew that this 17-year-old violent boy that has just committed a murder, I'm pretty sure that Alicia saw Jimmy's dead body laying in the snow when she'd gone outside. She knew what Clay was capable of and that he was in a really bad headspace at this point in time. She didn't want to give him those keys. But eventually, the other students convinced her and she threw the keys out of the window. Clay grabbed them, went and found Alicia's car, jumped in it, and then sped off into the desert morning. Police were alerted to this urgent case right away, and they rather quickly got a hit on the car. They managed to locate Clay, still kind of in that general area. Obviously, he had no idea where he was going. He didn't know his way around Escalante. But it was a really small town, and a high-speed police car chase ensued in this tiny town. In fact, it was so small that Clay actually almost ran over and killed the mayor of the town and his wife, who were just on a morning stroll. Eventually, the cops used ramming tactics. They rammed into the back of Clay's car to try to bring the chase to a stop before he could hurt anyone, before he could go out of control in this car. And maybe I spoke a bit too soon, because when they rammed into the back of him, it did cause his car to go out of control. Witnesses say they saw it flying through the air. But of course, when it eventually crashed, police had him. He couldn't run away from them now, and they were able to apprehend Clay. His escape came to a sudden and violent halt, and amazingly, Clay got out of that crash with only a few scratches and bruises. But the two victims that he brutally beat on his way out of camp wouldn't be so lucky. 61-year-old Jimmy died from his injuries just a few hours after the attack. And 37-year-old Alicia was left disabled after her injuries. She struggled for the next 2 years and eventually passed away, I believe, from the injuries that she sustained that day. Jimmy's widow ended up suing Turnabout Ranch, saying that Clay should have never even been accepted into the program in the first place. Apparently, they're not supposed to accept kids that are potentially violent or have suicidal tendencies, and Clay had both. He had tried to kill himself once before, he'd drunk bleach, and they weren't supposed to take these kind of kids into the program because clearly they are not very well-trained professionals at dealing with mental health crises. Danielle says that the day after Clay escaped, Turnabout Ranch brought all the kids together, made them all sit in a circle, and they told them about the incident and that Jimmy was dead. Imagine how traumatizing that must be to these kids who are already scared enough as it is. They are being consistently abused day in, day out, and now they have potential murders to worry about too. Clay Brewer was 17 years old when all of this happened, and he was sentenced to an initial 5 years in prison, and I'm not really sure how that whole system works. I don't think we really do an initial sentence and then extend it here in the UK, but the idea is that he has this 5-year initial sentence that could go up to a life sentence, I think, depending on how he does in those first 5 years in prison. But back to Danielle's YouTube video where she calls out all of this abuse. In it, she actually demanded an apology from Dr. Phil. And she gives him a deadline too, which I love. She was not messing around with this. She said, "You are gonna respond." She said that Dr. Phil had a month from when that video was posted for him to apologize publicly, not only to her, but to all of the other kids that he has ever sent to one of these sick and twisted facilities. She mentions in this video actually that this isn't even the first time that Turnabout Ranch has been involved in controversies. There was actually a lawsuit against them in 2012 by a woman named Elizabeth who had come forward about all of the horrible things she'd been through there too. Elizabeth said that at the age of 15, she was force-fed at the ranch. She was made to wash dishes with bleach, like with her bare hands, and she was made to do that until her hands bled. They were burning and drying up and scaling and bleeding, and the staff didn't care. And what is so heartbreaking about Elizabeth's story is that she finally gained the courage to actually come forward about this 7 years after she was in the camp. But the judge ended up clearing the ranch of all these allegations, saying that Elizabeth had waited too long to come forward with all of this now, and nothing could be done. Which always makes me so mad. If the only reason that your case is getting thrown out is because it's been too long, then that fucking speaks volumes to me. If they were completely innocent and they felt like it was going to be a really easy case to win, then why not just do it? Why not just prove yourselves right? But they didn't do it for a reason, hey. And even though that lawsuit was kind of thrown out by the judge, surely Dr. Phil's team must have been aware of it. Like, when they first typed in Turnabout Ranch, when they're thinking of working with them on the show, surely they did a check for allegations and lawsuits and accusations. I just personally find it very hard to believe that the Dr. Phil team had no idea of these previous allegations. Anyway, the comments on Danielle Bregoli's video coming out about all of this are the complete opposite of all of the hate and ridicule that she'd experienced in the first part of her career, and it must have felt like a huge shift for her to finally feel supported by the world rather than hated or laughed at. Just after this YouTube video went live, Dr. Phil went on a news program to specifically discuss these allegations, and he took no responsibility for what happened to Danielle or Hannah. Dr. Phil's exact words were, and yes, I am going to read out a really big quote right now. He said, "She went to Turnabout 4 or 5 years ago and she had a bad experience. Obviously, I would hate that. We'd be sorry about that. But we don't have anything to do with what happens with guests once they leave the stage. That's between the guardian and the parent and whatever facility they go to. So we're not involved in that. We don't have any feedback from them. So whatever happens once they are there, that's between them and the facility. I would assume if she had a problem, she would file a complaint with the proper authorities 5 years ago. I don't know much about it." And did that quote make any of you as mad as it made me? Oh my god, I was raging when I first heard that, so let's break it down, shall we? To admit on TV that you don't have anything to do with guests once they leave your stage is quite insane, given the fact that he is a doctor. He's not just any other regular TV show host. It's not like a game show where you don't have to keep in contact with the people on your show, but this is a girl whose life you promised to change. This is big shit, like very, very serious. You can't have a show where you promise to change people's lives and you do such intense things for them, like send them away to a boarding school for months, but also then refuse to keep in contact. Keep in mind that these are already vulnerable, traumatized children that they are sending away to these camps. There's no excuse for them to not do adequate follow-ups. I mean, what a shoddy job from someone that claims to be a doctor. Plus, Danielle even said herself that her mum consented to sending the Dr. Phil show some like progress reports from Turnabout Ranch. So it's just not adding up, that quote of Dr. Phil's. And that last bit pissed me off more than anything else. I would assume if she had a problem, she would file a complaint with the proper authorities 5 years ago. Are you fucking joking me, Philip McGraw? Obviously, we've spoken many times in this video about the several reasons why she probably didn't come out about her experience at that point in time. A huge factor of it being the pressure that his show put on her. It's crazy that this quote-unquote doctor can't understand a child's psychology enough to understand why she wouldn't have spoken out at the time. There's such little sympathy for Danielle in that quote. I find it honest, oh my god, it enrages me. And you know what? Thank fuck that show's not going anymore. It was shit anyway. Shit show. Saying that once people have left his show, he doesn't have anything to do with them, that is just crazy. He's basically saying that he washes his hands of them. Like, he's gotten the reaction that he wanted, he gets the ratings on his TV show, and then it's good luck, have a nice life, good luck with those problems that you came on my show about. I'm not going to keep in touch. After her first Dr. Phil episode, it wasn't just Danielle Bregoli that went viral, it was the show as a whole. I mean, yes, it was already a successful show, but Danielle and that meme really put it back into regular conversation. Dr. Phil and the rest of the people on his team had profited immensely from Danielle's pain and trauma. As far as Danielle saw it, Dr. Phil was making himself out to be a hero, saying he's saving all of these troubled teens from themselves, but Danielle called bullshit. It seems like it's all just an ego thing for Dr. Phil. I really don't think he cares about the individual guests that come on his show as much as he cares about the show making him a rich, famous celebrity. What really gets me about the show, if you've ever seen it or if you've ever watched it until the very end, once he's done giving people this advice, he'll then get up and walk through the cheering crowd waving like he's fucking royalty. It's just so clear that he loves being Dr. Phil. Like, he's not in that job to genuinely help people and to make a difference to these people's lives. And cases like Danielle's are the consequences of that. It's just such a shame that that same show wasn't made, but just with a different doctor, one that actually cared about the people that he was going to be helping. Dr. Phil was not that man. And thank fuck the show's gone! In 2022, Hannah Archuleta's case against Dr. Phil was actually dropped, which is incredibly disappointing, especially given that she'd gone out and gotten a really good lawyer, one that specialised in protecting women in abuse cases. This lawyer had worked with victims of R. Kelly, Bill Crosby, Roman Polanski. Hannah really hoped that this person would be able to bring her justice too. But unfortunately, the lawyer thought it would just be too difficult of a case to fight. He thought that they didn't have a chance of winning. Hannah, Paris, Danielle, and all of those other kids that have ever been sent to one of these awful correctional facilities are still carrying some level of trauma from what they experienced as a child. Every day, those kids were humiliated, gaslit, and abused by adults that had a duty of care over them and should have known better. And despite all of these terrible experiences coming to light, and despite all of these really, really brave survivors coming forward with their stories, the troubled teen correctional facility industry is still making millions of dollars every year. And every week, more kids are being kidnapped from their beds, ripped away from their family, and sent to these awful places. So why, after all of these horrible stories of abuse, are parents still paying a lot of money to send their kids there? And that is a question that I don't really have an answer for. I think there's a few different elements to it. I think some parents are really fooled by the glossy advertising that makes it look like a positive experience. Though I think there are some parents that do know what goes on those camps, but they think that's just what their kid needs. I think a lot of the older generation are still all about like hard labor and tough love. That's what naughty kids need to fix them. Or maybe another element of it is that parents are genuinely being fooled by therapists that are on commission to recommend these kind of camps. It's just such an awful situation that is still going on. It's still so vast at the moment, and it needs talking about so much more. Breaking Code Silence, the group that Danielle and Paris Hilton are both a part of, is still uncovering abuse at these camps all over the US to this day. We're gonna link their website down below because there's a lot of useful resources on there. If you've been affected by anything that we've talked about in this video, there's a lot that can help you on there. There's also a bit to donate on there if you want to help out the cause, and there's also a section on their website for people to submit their own testimonies. So if you have a story very similar to this, first of all, I'm so sorry and I hope you're doing better, but you could share it on the website. And I think having all of these stories all in one place, and there's power in numbers. Clearly, these women coming out one after another, they were inspiring each other, encouraging each other, making it known that there is a support network out there for victims just like them, for whenever they're ready to talk, whenever they're ready to go over what happened to them, there is a whole network of survivors just like them waiting to hear about it. Like I said, if you have been affected by anything we've talked about in today's video, the link is down below in the description. And thank you so much for watching this one. It's been a super, super long episode. I've actually filmed this over the course of 3 days. Could you tell? See if you can figure out where I swapped filming days. If any of you get it right in the comments, I'll be really shocked because I think I do a good job of chameleoning into how I looked the day before. I also want to say again, thank you to Rocket Money for sponsoring this video. Remember, you can go to rocketmoney.com/Eleanor to get started for free. But that is all I have for this episode of Freaky Friday. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, please leave a thumbs up, or if you want to watch another video of mine, there's one on screen right now. Or you could click the little circle with my face in to subscribe, because we post content like this every single week. Anyway, all of that being said, I will see you in next week's video. Bye!